Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Wetleg. Today the topic of my discussion is the motility in esophagus and stomach. First, I am going to discuss motility in esophagus. Before discussing the motility in esophagus, we should know how the food is brought into the mouth and how it is masticated, then swallowed, and then we will discuss that how it moves throughout the esophagus to the stomach and so on. So first we shall discuss the prehension. Prehension is nothing but the grasping of food. So the act of grasping of food is actually prehension. Different animals have different prehensile organs to undergo prehension. In case of horse, upper lip is the organ of prehension. In cattle, prehensile organ is tongue. In goat, prehensile organ is tongue and upper lip both. While in case of dog, prehensile organ is its head and jaws. Prehension is controlled by central nervous system. So facial nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve, and motor branch of trigeminal nerve control the muscles for prehension. When food is brought into the mouth, then it is chewed or masticated so that it can be converted into small sized chunks that can easily pass through the esophagus, and this also helps in the digestion of food. So mastication is actually the chewing of food, and it involves the actions of jaws, tongue, and cheeks. So this chewing of food by the action of teeth causes the breakdown of large food particles into smaller one that can easily pass through the esophagus. And in addition to this chewing process, this mastication process also causes slight digestion of this food material. When this food is chewed, then it is also moistured and lubricated by mixing it with saliva so that it can be easily swallowed by forming a bolus. So after chewing of food, a bolus is formed, and then this bolus is swallowed. And this action of swallowing of bolus is actually deglutition. This swallowing of food involves two stages, one is voluntary and other is involuntary stage, and these occur after the food has been well masticated. In the voluntary phase of swallowing, food is molded into a bolus by the tongue and then pushed back into the pharynx. Now when this bolus reaches the pharynx, sensory nerve endings detect the presence of the bolus and then initiate the involuntary portion of the swallow reflex. Pharynx is actually a common passage for both respiration and digestive tract, and it allows only a single process at a time. It means that when air is passing through the pharynx, then it allows only the entry of air, and when food is passing through the pharynx, then only food passes from the pharynx. When this bolus of food enters near the pharynx, then breathing stops because the pharynx will now allow only the passage of food through it and not the air. So first the soft palate will be elevated and it will close the pharyngeal opening of nasopharynx. Then tongue pushes up against hard palate and it closes the oral opening of pharynx. In this way, both openings of nasopharynx and oropharynx are closed. In the next step, larynx will be pulled forward, and this pulling will cause the glottis to come under the epiglottis. And when glottis will be covered by the epiglottis, then this will cause the closing of the laryngeal opening. So the opening of larynx will be closed. At the same time, arytenoid cartilages that are present in the larynx will constrict further, and this constriction will cause the closing of the opening of larynx further. So when the nasal opening of pharynx and the opening of larynx will be closed, then the food bolus will easily be diverted and will pass through the pharynx. The complex actions of swallowing process are controlled by lower motor neurons. Efferent nerve fibers from these centers travel in the facial nerve, vagus nerve, hypoglossal nerve, and glossopharyngeal nerve and motor branch of trigeminal nerve. So the facial nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve, and motor branch of trigeminal nerve control the muscles for prehension, and also the complex action of swallowing. When neurological lesions are present in the cranial nerves or in the brainstem, then there occurs problem with the process of swallowing, mastication, and prehension or capturing of food, because all these processes are controlled by central nervous system. Now let's talk about motility in esophagus. The esophagus contains an outer longitudinal layer and inner circular layer of muscles. But as compared with other areas of the gut, the most of its muscular wall is composed of striated muscle fibers, and not the smooth muscle fibers. In most domestic animals, the entire length of esophageal musculature is striated muscles. So esophagus is mainly composed of striated muscles. But in case of horses, primates and cats, a portion of the distal esophagus is composed of smooth muscles. The striated portions of the esophagus are under the control of somatic motor neurons in the vagus nerve, whereas the smooth muscle portion is under the direct control of enteric nervous system and indirect control of autonomic nervous system. The esophagus is composed of an upper sphincter, then body, and then the lower sphincter. The upper esophageal sphincter is called cricopharyngeal muscle. This muscle and the upper end of esophagus both are attached to the cricoid cartilage of the larynx. So this sphincter muscle and upper end of the esophagus are attached to the cricoid cartilage of the larynx. This sphincter is normally closed, because if it is not closed and it remains open all the time, and then air will pass from the pharynx to the esophagus all the times. So it is only opened when the bolus of the food reaches near it. When swallowing is not taking place, the muscle compresses this cricopharyngeal muscle compresses the ends of the esophagus against the cartilage of larynx, and in this way it tightly closes the upper esophageal opening. During the action of swallowing process, larynx is pulled forward. As this cricopharyngeal muscle compresses the end of esophagus against the cartilage of larynx, and now larynx is being pulled forward. So in this way, this cricopharyngeal muscle or sphincter will relax, and its relaxation will allow the passage of bolus through it. So in this way, food enters the esophagus. When food is brought into the esophagus, the next step is to propel this food throughout the esophagus. And these propulsive movements which occur in the esophagus to propel the food throughout the esophagus are known as peristalsis. So food is propelled throughout the esophagus by propulsive movements known as peristalsis. This peristalsis actually consists of a moving ring of constriction in the wall of this tubular esophagus. In the esophagus, these rings start at the cranial end and progress towards the stomach. So we can say that that the constriction of the muscles starts at the cranial end and moves aborally. And in this way, the food material is pushed aborally in the esophagus. As the oral side of esophagus is contracting to propel the food material, so the aboral side should also relax so that it can accommodate that food material. So in addition to this constriction of the circular muscles that cause the constriction of the tubular organ and cause the propulsion of food through it, there also be some contraction of longitudinal muscles just ahead of the oral surface, or this constriction of the or this contraction of the longitudinal muscles must occur aborally. When the contraction of longitudinal muscles will occur, then the size of esophageal lumen will increase, and in this way it will become easy to accommodate the advancing food bolus. So during the swallowing of food, upper esophageal sphincter first relaxes as the pharynx constricts. So food is pushed into the upper portion of esophageal body. Then wave of peristalsis moves or propels this material towards the stomach. As the food bolus reaches the distal end of esophagus, the lower sphincter of esophagus also relaxes, and this relaxation causes the entry of this ingested matter to the stomach. So in this way, the esophagus is cleared of food materials. And if the esophagus is not cleared of all of the material by this primary wave of peristalsis, another wave of peristalsis occurs, and this second wave of peristalsis is known as secondary peristaltic activity or secondary peristaltic wave. One or more secondary waves are adequate for pushing the material into the stomach and clearing the esophagus. But if the food or foreign bodies become lodged into the esophagus, then secondary waves of peristalsis may lead to the muscle spasm, and this spasm will constrict around the lodged material, and in this way whole of the esophagus will be completely cleared of the food materials. And one important thing to note is that when the process of swallowing or deglutition is not taking place, the body of the esophagus is relaxed, but the upper and lower sphincters remain constantly constricted, so that the food material doesn't enter the esophagus and to the stomach. Sorry, this constriction occurs to prevent the passage of air through the esophagus, that is the air that is constantly passing through the pharynx. So when these sphincter muscles will be constricted, there will occur no entry of air into the esophagus. Now let's move to the motility in stomach. The stomach stores the food for particular time and acts as a grinder and reduces the size of food particles. When this food is grinded into small particles, then the stomach causes the release of only those grinded food particles that are compatible for digestion into the small intestine. So it also serves the food to the small intestine. So its one function of the stomach is to act as a storage vat and to store the food material for a particular interval of time, and the second function is to serve the food to the small intestine after being grinded in the stomach. And in this way it controls the rate of delivery of food to the small intestine and checks the consistency of the material that is present in the stomach. And if the consistency of the material that is present in the stomach is not compatible for digestion within small intestine, then it breaks it into small particles by the process of grinding, and finally delivers or serves this food to the small intestine. The stomach is further divided into two physiological regions, and these are the proximal region and distal region. The proximal region of the stomach at the esophageal end of the stomach serves as a storage organ, or serves in storage function, and it retains the food in it. On the other hand, the distal region of the stomach serves as a grinding and sieving function. So it causes the grinding of the food and breaks solid pieces of food into smaller pieces that are compatible for digestion in the small intestine. And when this food is broken down into smaller particles, then the distal region of the stomach allows only those smallest particles that are compatible for digestion in the small intestine. And in this way the distal stomach checks the consistency of the material with comparison to the to digestion in the small intestine, and in this way it acts as a sieve. So the proximal region of the stomach is a storage serves in the storage purpose, while the distal region serves in sieving function and grinding of the food. The major muscular activity that is occurring in the proximal region of the stomach are tonic contractions, and these tonic contractions are not so strong, but they are weak contractions, and these contractions are maintained from several minutes up to hours at a time. And in this way these tonic contractions are of continuous nature, and they provide gentle propulsion of the material into the distal stomach. So the muscular activity of the proximal stomach is weak, of continuous nature, and is provided by tonic contractions, and these tonic contractions, which are weak and continuous in nature, cause the propulsion of material into the distal stomach. The major muscular reflex of proximal stomach is adaptive relaxation, and this reflex is characterized by the relaxation of muscles as food enters the stomach. And because of this relaxation, the stomach can dilate to accept large quantities of food without an increase in the intraluminal pressure. So the major muscular activity of the proximal stomach is tonic contraction that cause propulsion of material to the distal stomach, and major muscular reflex of proximal stomach is adaptive relaxation, which causes the food to enter the stomach because of the relaxation of the stomach walls. The muscular activity of the distal stomach is completely different from that of the proximal stomach. In the distal stomach, there is intense slow wave activity and muscular contractions are frequently present there. Intense slow wave activity means that the slow waves that are present in the distal stomach, or that are produced in the distal stomach, have increased velocity and amplitude, and due to this increased amplitude there occurs frequent muscle contractions in the distal stomach, and these frequently produced muscular contractions are due to the frequently produced action potentials within the distal stomach. So these strong muscular contractions cause peristalsis, strong waves of peristalsis. So the strong waves of peristalsis begin at about middle of the stomach and migrate distally with the slow waves towards the pylorus. As this wave of peristalsis reaches near the pylorus or pyloric sphincter, this pyloric sphincter constricts. The function of this constriction is to allow only the selective particles to pass into the small intestine. So only the smallest particles that are compatible for digestion in the small intestine are allowed for the gastric exit, or they are allowed to pass into the small intestine from stomach. And the particles that don't match the consistency of the small intestine, or that are not compatible for digestion in the small intestine, are again grinded in the stomach and then passed into the small intestine. In this way, the particles that are leaving the stomach during the digestive phase of activity are less than 2 millimeters in diameter. In this way, the peristaltic actions of the distal stomach walls serves not only to propel the food, but it also causes the grinding and mixing of the food. As we know that the gastrointestinal motility is controlled by neurohumoral factors, similarly the motility of the stomach is also under neurohumoral control. So the fibers of vagus nerve synapse on the nerve cell bodies of the extensive gastric myenteric plexus and exert a high degree of control over gastric motility. So the neural control of gastric motility occurs through the formation of synapse by vagus nerve on the nerve cell bodies of myenteric plexus. In the proximal stomach, this activity of the vagus nerve, or this vagal activity, suppresses muscular contraction and leads to adaptive relaxation. And this relaxation occurs so that it can accommodate more of the food in it, and it can store the food coming through esophagus. While in the distal stomach, this vagal stimulation causes intense peristaltic activity so that it can be mixed and passed on to the small intestine. So the vagal stimulation of the distal stomach's motility is mediated by acetylcholine. So acetylcholine causes or stimulates the motility of distal stomach. On the other hand, in proximal stomach, muscular contraction is inhibited, and this inhibitory mediator may be vasoactive intestinal peptide. So this was the neural control of gastric motility. The hormonal control or humoral control of gastric motility is not completely understood, but we say that gastrin is secreted from the cells in the gastric antrum, and this gastrin appears to enhance the gastric motility, while cholecystokinin, secretin, and gastric inhibitory peptide appear to suppress gastric motility in case of dog. So gastric motility is enhanced by the gastrin, while gastric motility is suppressed by cholecystokinin, secretin, and gastric inhibitory peptide. So due to this neurohumoral control of the gastric motility and the waves of peristalsis, the gastric contents are released into the duodenum or small intestine, and stomach is emptied. But the rate at which food leaves the stomach must match the rate at which it can be digested and absorbed by the small intestine. The contents of the stomach enter the small intestine in such amount that can be easily accommodated and digested by the small intestine. And in this way, the rate of gastric emptying is matched by the rate of digestion and absorption by the small intestine. Sometimes some types of materials are ingested like bones and indigestible foreign bodies, and they cannot be reduced to particles less than 2 millimeter in diameter. So during the digestive phase of gastric motility, such kind of materials don't leave the stomach. To clear the stomach of such indigestible debris, a particular type of motility occurs between the meals, and this motility pattern is called interdigestive motility complex. When the interdigestive motility complex occurs, then there occurs a strong wave of peristalsis. Uh, there are strong waves of peristalsis that sweep over the distal stomach and reach the pylorus, and in this way pylorus relaxes and forces this indigestible debris material into the duodenum. These peristaltic waves of interdigestive motility complex occur approximately 1 hour after the stomach is relatively empty of digestible material. Eating during this period again causes the gastric motility and inhibits this interdigestive motility complex. So there is a question that how interdigestive motility complex occurs in herbivores which eat almost constantly. So the herbivores which eat almost constantly have a slightly different pattern. The interdigestive motility complex occurs at approximately hourly intervals, even with digestible food material in the stomach. So this rhythmic or constantly occurring interdigestive motility complex in constantly eating herbivores doesn't need the emptying of stomach from the digestible material.